Hello there and welcome, dear Virtual Space Hero community, to our weekly Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live. I hope you had a tremendous week as I had. You see maybe that last week I was still in my yellow phase. Today we changed a little bit lighting and I'm in my blue phase. I feel slightly like Picasso, as you could imagine. Anyways, it is fantastic having you with us. We are again, as every week, streaming also this week to our three main platforms, starting here with LinkedIn. We have Facebook streaming, and we also stream to our YouTube channel. So wherever you're following us, a big hug to you out there. And let us know, please, where are you connecting from? Let us know in the chat also your questions for today's session. We would really like to engage with you, although we cannot see you. So what are we going to talk about today? Those of you who have been with us last week, it was a tremendous conversation we had with Valerie Oleinik about gamification and how to use gamification for strategy workshops. So today we are moving on and we are going to talk about how can we facilitate innovation in the virtual space. And I'm tremendously excited to have with me an expert on the topic, because we all know that it is one of the toughest challenges of executives. How do we get our people to work or to think creatively? So how can we ask them to challenge the status quo, but while still keeping your everyday operations to run smoothly? So creative thinking and ideation processes are on top of the agenda. And now I'm going to use a quote of my today's guest, who said, "Going forward, optimal execution will be the only cost of entry, and continuing innovation will be the necessary differentiator." And with that, I'm super happy to open the Virtual Space Hero doors here to Clark Quinn, connecting also from the US. Hello there.
Hey, hello, folks.
Hello there, Clark. It's fantastic having you with me here on the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live to talk about how can we facilitate innovation in the virtual space. But help me understand, or give us a little bit of an intro about yourself, and how did you get into researching, writing, consulting, and speaking so much about innovation? And it is probably also connected with your company called Quinnovation, right?
Absolutely. So it's a twisted tale, is what I should say. I saw the connection between computers learning as an undergraduate, and we didn't have a major in it, but I designed my own major, and it's been my career ever since. Now, the interesting thing about learning as you get into it is you want to facilitate it, but you have to have good design processes. And to get creative and better in designing better learning, you have to be innovative. And particularly with all the new technologies, because it's computers and learning, and computers have been on an incredible trajectory of change and improvement, you have to continually be thinking ahead of the curve about what is happening and how can we take advantage of these. We too often fall into these habits of using technology in the ways we use the previous technologies instead of finding out their key affordances. So anyways, I was designing and programming educational computer games, which is an area you really have to be creative in, and realized we didn't know enough. And I went back to get a PhD in what was effectively applied cognitive science. And the lab there was focusing on interface design. My twist was, designing for how we think. My twist was, how do we design for how we learn? And after I got out and I did a postdoc and then was a academic researching in educational technology, but I was teaching interface design. And at that time, there was a lot of work in how do we make our design processes more appropriate. And they were looking at things like situated and participatory design, and how to be creative in the design, not to get trapped into small spaces. And so it was all about innovation, and it was also the gestation of all the thoughts that are now appearing in what's called design thinking. So I was steeped in this a long time ago, and now we have this wonderful label for it. Great. Long story short, joined a couple government-sponsored initiatives, and then I joined a startup, and then in 2001 became an independent consultant, as something you know about, right? And have been since then. I've been assisting organizations, and I sort of look at I have this cheeky statement: L&D isn't doing near what it could and should, and what it is doing, it's doing badly. Other than that, it's fine. So a lot of my work is, that what it is doing, it's doing badly. Bad learning design, not influenced by learning science, which is an area I'm deeply interested in. Cognition and learning sciences really are part of the core of what I care about and do. And how do we apply that? And the second thing is the engagement. How do we truly make an experience emotionally compelling as well as cognitively effective? So that's what we're doing badly. And then what we're not doing is going beyond formal learning to informal learning. And that's the topic. Informal learning really is about what we're talking about today. When you're doing problem solving, when you're doing troubleshooting, when you're doing research, when you're doing design, you don't know the answer when you start. Therefore, it is a form of learning. It's just one where there isn't somebody who can come in with the answer. So you have to have good processes to help you do the best exploration to find the innovative solutions.
So those of you out there who are interested in L&D literature, readings, blog articles, definitely you need to check out quinnovation.com. That's also how you find Clark's blog posts. Check them out. They're fantastic. And Clark, I was also reading through your cheeky statement about L&D, as you called it. So how does L&D react to that? Because it's pretty provocative, isn't it?
I think it's an important strategic move for L&D. For right now, L&D, what it does mostly is courses, which is about optimal execution, doing right the things we know we need to do. We can also include and should include performance support in that as well, putting it information in the world when we can and only putting in the head when we have to because it's really hard. So that's what L&D does. And that's great, but there, as the quote you cited at the beginning of this conversation, optimal execution is only going to be the cost of entry. We are living in an era of increasing change, of requiring agility and the flux mindset. And as a consequence, continual innovation is going to be a necessary differentiator for organizations. And what I just said about innovation, research, problem solving, all being a form of informal learning, therefore, who better to be responsible for helping the org being as innovative as possible than the people who really understand learning? And that should be L&D. That should be us. Now we have to take ownership. We have to take ownership of the learning science and the cognitive science and really understanding what makes that work. But if we do, and we become the facilitators of it, we become the facilitators of the most strategic advantage any organization can have. And we move from being that sort of peripheral, we know we have to have it, to as essential to the success of the organization as IT and finance and any other, operations and anything else. And I think that's a huge opportunity for L&D.
That is also a little bit what was sort of my first question. Why is facilitating innovation a valuable extension of the L&D role? What you were already answering now. But so let me ask you one question. You were relating, of course, informal learning to facilitating innovation or to innovative, creative processes. If we think about organizations, if I, for example, think about my clients as well, where I'm doing trainings, I have very few clients who consult with me on informal learning strategies or organizational culture, organizational learning culture, whatever you want to call it, or whatever initiatives there could be. But we know that most of the times, I believe it is very much focused on the formal part, as you were saying it. How, out of your experience, how many of the companies that you are working for, because you're really positioned as the innovation creative expert and informal learning expert, how many of the companies who are getting in touch with you are also really considering that part?
It really is totally separate in a sense. There are people who want to improve their learning and they come to me just for that. But other people, I put out a book about my sort of revolutionary views about learning and development, revolutionize learning and development. And people who've seen that and get the message come to me just for that side of it. So it's not, but I guess one answer to your question is the ones that are coming to me just for L&D like to hear that message about informal learning. They get that message about informal learning, but they're struggling just to do what they can do in the organization. They're barely surviving. And in fact, the statistics back this up. You ask, ATD did their workplace survey and found that, about 50% of organizations actually think their instructional design is effective. That's not very good outcome. We're less than half of us, and only a third of chief learning officers really believe their people are keeping up. So they're struggling to meet just that optimal execution side. It's hard for them to get their mind around this other part of it. And yet, that is the opportunity. And in fact, if you get that right, you actually reduce the requirements for formal learning, because you're beginning to develop. It goes beyond just facilitating informal learning, but helping people learn to learn better is another aspect of this that's really an interesting opportunity.
I think that's such an important point that you're making here. And I talked about that, I don't remember, in one of my LinkedIn lives, because I have only one client that I'm doing a training for about self-directed learning. Just because we do know that, particularly in the virtual space now, as many of us switch to 100% also virtual or online learning, whatever, it is even more difficult to keep track, to keep the pace, because many of us have not developed that competencies either. And I have exactly one client who requested one of those kind of trainings. But if we come back to informal learning, you are saying that, of course, if you have a good informal learning environment, or your organizational learning culture is, how to say, a very developed one, you need less formal learning. So what would you suggest companies to invest in to start with? Is it the informal learning strategy? Is it focusing on the organizational learning culture? What would be a first step? You know what I mean?
Yes, I do. I'm actually going to separate two things, because your ability to facilitate brainstorming sessions, for instance, the practices are going to improve the outcomes. But that is, you will get better outputs, but you won't get it unless you also begin to shift to a more learning focus in your organization, creating that culture. So there's the practices, but the culture, and they are related, but they're separate, and you could develop one and not develop the other. But the first step, I argue, that L&D needs to do is to start doing these practices internal to L&D first. Don't take it outward until you truly understand it, have instantiated it, and made it work in your organizational culture. Because then you have the credibility to take it out to the rest of the organization and say, we've got it working for us. Here's how it works. Let's bring this out to you. So that means that internal to L&D, you need to start showing your work. And this includes the leaders. If they're saying, oh, please show your work, but they're not doing it, is anybody going to truly believe it's safe? And when you talk about organizational culture, there are four main elements that Garvin, Edmondson, and Gino came up with in their learning organization dimensions. The first one is diversity, tapping into that, not just tolerating it, but valuing it, recognizing how you take advantage of that in your brainstorming and in your teamwork. The second thing is openness to new ideas. And it's interesting, somebody passed me this book by Jennifer Mueller called Creative Change. And she documents how many organizations say they want innovation, set up mechanisms for innovation, and then they have this hidden feature that blocks innovation. It's because they want to evaluate the innovative ideas by absolutely certain criteria, instead of recognizing that experimentation and failure is part of innovation. And so they squelch their own innovation. And so you have to truly have an open mind and the ability to try new things and being willing for them to fail. Third element is time for reflection. So many people say, oh, we don't have time for that. Really? Because you'll actually be more productive if you take some of your time away working and spend it on reflection. And people find that really hard to get their mind around. And the last one is the most critical one, and Amy Edmondson's continued to work on this. This is psychological safety. I like to joke, in the US, we have this thing called the Miranda Law, that if you're arrested, they have to say this to you. Anything you say can and will be held against you in a court of law. And you may have heard that in American TV shows if you watch any Law and Order ones.
I have.
That's always important.
I have.
Yeah. But in an organization, that can be true too. You can have a Miranda organization where anything you say can and will be held against you. Is anybody going to share their best ideas in that environment? Absolutely not. They're only going to say what's safe. So you need to make it safe to share unusual ideas, make it safe to experiment. And that is the cultural element that allow you to get the best out of doing the practices. So I suggest L&D has to practice, show your work, or work out loud, or learn out loud, however you do it, not just what you're doing, because this allows people to see what you're doing, provide comments on it to improve it if they can see it, but also to align with it. There's a number of other things, getting brainstorming right, recognizing you need to think independently before people share their ideas, because otherwise they'll squelch other people's thinking. The value of, creating an environment where people will comment constructively on one another's, but making sure it's also not personal. You're not attacking the person, but the idea, even if you're saying this could be improved, making it positive comments. So there's a whole bunch of stuff. But the first step is L&D has to get it working right internally so they have credibility when they take it out.
Yeah. I was just thinking about, because when you were talking about managers showing or talking about their work and making it transparent to say, so I was thinking about working out loud, because I even had John Snapper last December on my show here as well. We're talking about learning and working out loud, of course, and learning out loud as well. And I love that, because transparency is, for me, one of the ground pillars when we talk about new ways of working. New ways of working somehow are related always to remote work environments, right? And that aspect of transparency is very much connected also with psychological safety, because the moment that processes or activities, roles, responsibilities, projects are more transparent, also people feel more empowered. And the other thing that I was just thinking, Clark, is I was doing some research on error culture, which of course as well with psychological safety and all these aspects that you were mentioning is very much related here to innovation and creativity. Because the moment I have an error culture where small deviations are punished, to say so, clearly people cannot be neither creative nor innovative, correct?
What I'm not sure I'm hearing error culture, ERROR culture.
Exactly. How do we deal with the mistakes in our companies? Yeah.
Right. How you deal with them is critical. Do you punish them, or do you acknowledge them? I loved a story I heard. I was at a conference that Marsha Khanna organized it on creating a learning culture. And in it, a small organization mentioned what they did. They rang a bell when the lesson was learned. And I thought that was really interesting, because you don't want to celebrate mistakes, but you want to allow them. If you celebrate the learning from them, you get on several benefits. You make it safe to continue to experiment, but you also keep anybody from having to make the same mistake because you share the learning from it. And that's absolutely such a valuable form of transparency, just what you're saying. And I absolutely agree that, transparency, that I was reading an interesting article in the Australian news about psychopaths in organizations, how to deal with them. And one of the tricks they use is by sending rumors and doing a lot of stuff behind secretively. If you have transparency, you have an ability to address this in a more effective way, right? It's harder for them to do their manipulations.
Oh, that's an interesting aspect. I've never thought about that. Cool. Great. Thanks so much, Clark. Well, Virtual Space Hero community, I do see you out there, even though you don't think that I see you. So let us also know your questions and your comments. So what are your takes on how to create a safe environment, for example, in a remote organization, so that people are really speaking up and providing creative or new ideas for the organization. But let me ask you one more question, Clark. I'm coming back to what we were talking about. So we were talking about creative innovation, innovative processes, creativity, ideation, but you are also writing a lot about different types of ideas, correct? So is it important that we know about these different types of ideas in order to be better able to tackle the aspects of creativity and innovation, and what are they?
Well, I tend to break innovation into sort of two styles, and it's important because each of them has different benefits for their types of ideation. So I talk about fast innovation, and that's when you have a specific problem you need. And this is when organizations will create a tiger team or assign a group to it. And that's where diversity is important. And yet, and you need effective brainstorming, and you also need to ensure, although diverse, they have to have something in common, and that has to be a shared commitment to achieving the outcome. So that's when you're doing that sort of innovation, when you're trying to get people to solve an immediate problem, do research or design or troubleshooting or problem solving, you need to, what helps there are the ability to diverge before you converge. You need ways to capture the different ideas and stash them aside as they're generated and find ways to creatively combine them before you begin evaluating them and going forward. And in fact, the double diamond of design thinking says, do this first on the problem, make sure you're addressing the right problem, and then go, so diverge. Are we addressing the right problem? Let's get a bunch of research, make sure that what we think is the cause is the real cause, and then let's go and double diamond, diverge, converge to solve to find an answer. So that's the fast solution. And what works there is ability to create representations of ideas, places to stash ideas, ways to manage them, ways to then bring them forward and systematically evaluate them and prioritize them. Now, slow innovation is something different. And this is a lot of what Stephen Johnson talked about in his book, Where Do Good Ideas Come From? And Keith Sawyer talks about it in Group Genius as well. His book. This is the notion of ongoing percolation of ideas, creating an environment where new ideas will emerge, where people can experiment, as Google was allowing, at least for a while, one day a week for people to work on stuff that was a benefit to Google, but wasn't specific to their job. It's also, Stephen Johnson had a whole bunch of a list of items like the adjacent possible. So being exposed to other ideas that are clear. And I love what Harold Yarkey does with this personal knowledge management, where he talks about having a cycle of seek, sense, and share. So you continually being exposed to new ideas, and you fine-tune those channels. You have to actively look for new sources and weed out the ones that are more noise than signal, so that you're being exposed to related ideas that can spark ideas. And then that feeds into his sensing thing, and I tease that apart into two things. One is to represent what you think you're understanding. And I create a lot of diagrams. Diagramming is one of my ways of thinking out loud, and I share them in my blog. You get there from Quinnovation. My blog's actually learnless.com. Diagrams are powerful ways. But the other one is to experiment. You have to try things and reflect and see, and you generate your own understanding. And then the third element is sharing that back out. Who should this go to? Should it go to somebody specific? Should it be broadcast more broadly? That's why blogs are a great thing. They seem to be falling off. People now post in LinkedIn instead of their blogs. That doesn't matter where, but you share your ideas. Let other people see it as part of that transparency. It's part of show your work. It can be internal to the org or outside. So that cycle of being able to try new ideas and allowing, you also need spaces for people to interact, because where the best new ideas come from is that creative interaction. That's why Keith Sawyer titled his book Group Genius, because that myth of the individual genius going away and bringing back the new answer typically isn't what we see. It's being sparked, that creative friction where I interact with somebody else and we're negotiating and we have that conversation at the water cooler, which is why Jay Cross in his great book Informal Learning talked about reorganizing the office, which kind of is, I'll bring that back to virtual in a second. But in the office, he suggested putting the mailroom in the same place where the coffee is and the water cooler. So people are coming there for different reasons, but they're forced to interact, and that's where you spark new ideas. And how many of you, hopefully most of your audiences, have that experience of, having a conversation in the hall and suddenly getting a new idea and running off. And so you want to make that happen. And that's what's hard in virtual, is to get that spontaneous interaction. And so what you need to do are find ways to foster that. Have places where people can come just to chat. Have regular events where people share what they're doing in a more formal presentation. And I remember I heard this tale from this engineering firm, and I gave a talk one time, and this audience member got up and said, we're doing this. We're an engineering firm, and we have all these different groups doing different bits of engineering. And they wanted to, and they were all writing white papers, but they weren't finding ways, the time to read each other's white papers. And what they did was they had somebody read a white paper into an audio file. Now, this was a number of years ago, but it still makes sense. I'll bring it back again. But what they found is all those engineers came back and asked for more of those audio files, because what they were doing was then listening to those white papers on their commutes to and from work, and suddenly were far more aware of what was going on, were able to better interconnect. So how do you make that happen virtually? It's part of it is showing your work, but also bringing them together for special presentations, boiling it down and getting it and facilitating that. So if they're not great presenters, how do you help them unpack that, the essence of the idea that's new and valuable to share, so other people can find ways for it to spark their thinking? And we lose a lot of the presence. And so I would love to know what you've learned through your work about how do we bring that presence forward virtually,
I think
in a virtual environment, to overcome the lack of, interpersonal interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's such a super important point that you're mentioning there. And I wanted to pick up on that, because what we do see, and also the teams that I worked with and some of the leaders that I coached last year, those who were having regular, even just coffee meetings twice a week in the morning hours, where they were chit-chatting and maybe using breakout room functions or some other tools like Kumu Space, where they can really gather in small groups, and it's a little bit more like an in-presence chit-chat at a water cooler or coffee machine. Those were the leaders who did not only have a lot of trust in their team, they had a well-working team, they had time also to pick up on feelings, on context of their workers, but they also had the possibility, exactly what you were saying, to use that time, for example, or to establish another creativity hour, whatever it is. They were not calling it like that, but that was really used for having more exchange in the virtual space, or just giving a virtual room to do that. And I think, even though it is very criticized that in the virtual space you can't have these water cooler sort of talks or coffee machine, or in Europe we even say copy machine, because you very often meet at the copy machine, right? I think you can give that space to your people. You can open those spaces up, whether it's just a Google Hangout or it's a Zoom meeting room. But if it's open and people come in, people chat and start discussing those their projects, of course, also these small actions already bring a big difference, correct?
Absolutely. And one idea an organization I'm involved with used, at the beginning of every meeting, to ask, quickly, everybody share the one thing you'd like everybody else to know. It can be personal, it can be work, it can be whatever, but they're bringing out what's interesting to them, and you have to have a space for people to put out questions that other people can answer. This is the one question I really would love to hear an answer to. And again, it can be work related, it can be personal, but it's bringing forth that serendipity. And that's such a critical element, the unknown intersections, and how do you bring those ideas out? And so what you're talking about, having that space, and I've seen that so much in the virtual conversations I've had over the past year. People start by just talking about their lives when it's a small group, and then they get to the business at hand, and making space that's okay becomes an important part of developing the important relationship. You look at DC and Ryan's, self-determination theory, which overlaps fairly well with Dan Pink's, drive, but relatedness. is such an important part of feeling a part, of having motivation to work, along with autonomy and mastery. And L&D has a great role in that mastery part. So autonomy is the freedom to do stuff. And mastery is the support to succeed. And that's what L&D really can be doing, and in the informal space as well. And that's,
that is super, very great statement, very great input. Thanks a lot. Let me jump to one thing, because we were talking before already about formal, informal learning a little bit. We were tackling the organizational learning culture, and you were also already mentioning brainstorming as one of the approaches for like ideation, creative processes or new projects, whatever. Is brainstorming always a good approach? Are there other approaches that should be considered when we talk about these sort of group meetings in order to facilitate a creative process? What would you suggest here?
When you need to, when you're face to face, you want to use that time valuably. What's best is to have thought of, you can't bring people together and go, okay, everybody hears the problem and the first person speaks, because they've constrained the thinking. You need to share the ideas beforehand, and everybody has to have time and should be expected to generate a list of their own ideas. Then they might share those beforehand and come in and start discussing them, and deliberately first try and spark new ideas out of what they heard from other people. Then you want to evaluate and converge. But you also want to allow time for percolation, for people to have processed those ideas and sat and thought about them. Because, and I don't know if you've ever had this experience, I find it so valuable before I take a shower or go for a walk, or all those times when percolation can happen. I'll ask myself a question before I go in, head out. And many times the answer will have come to me by the time I come back at some point in that walk. And we want to allow that. We don't know, we recognize this, we've got this part solved, we've got that other part we haven't. Let it percolate. Allow time for that to happen. And the other critical thing to me is finding shared representations. And this is an area where I think we have a lack. I'm not happy with our collaboration tools. They're either.
What do you mean with shared representation? Just let me pick up on that. What do you mean? What do you mean with shared representation?
A way to. So our cognition is distributed. We used to have this myth that everything's in our head, and it turns out it's not. You can look at the work of Ed Hutchins with this cognition in the wild, and he documented really more accurately than anybody else how many tasks are solved by people working together with representations between what's in their head and external representations, what's in other people's head. So think about complex business models. They're in spreadsheets. We can't keep them all in our head. We use spreadsheets as a tool to represent them. And other times we have a flow of argumentation. We put it in a document, and we might have a set of conceptual relationships. We put it in a diagram. But these things are related to one another, yet we can't work on them in conjunction. There was a wonderful piece of software many decades ago, quite literally, that preceded sort of Excel and 1, 2, 3. It was called Trapeze, and it was called a presentation spreadsheet. It allowed you to have text blocks and number blocks, and they could relate to other number blocks you could time, but they would resize automatically. But you could also have charts, and you could also create pictures. It allowed you to put all of them in one space. And that sort of flexibility, and even mind maps, and creating explicitly linking bits and pieces of these together is an opportunity in my mind that we don't have. We don't have everything segmented by its modality instead of being more flexible in ability. So this is, to me, the missing element in our ability to really, truly collaborate more effectively. Because we get a limited set of tools, we have to all get expertise in using these tools, and then all of them have limits that keep us from going out to this space, which would really help accelerate our thinking. I don't know the absolute solution to that, but elements of it there. So anyways, I've sort of trajectoried away from your question. I apologize.
All good. But I think that's a really it's a difficult one, what you were mentioning now at the end. But let me pick up on what you were saying before as well. You were mentioning collaboration tools, that we are lacking collaboration tools also in order to facilitate innovation. Were you meaning that, or what do you mean with collaboration tools?
Collaboration tools. So we have pretty good communication tools now with Teams and Slack and things. We have a variety of ways to share ideas and comment on one ideas, but we don't have a good way to create a representation that we all can work on. Granted, we do have collaborative documents. I'm not, arguing against that. It's just that each of them are independent. They are restricted to a particular type of data, and they don't have good ways to interrelate. And that, to me, is what I mean by the limitation of our collaboration tools. By collaborating, by iteratively developing representations, that's how we can innovate and improve them. So somebody will create a spreadsheet, and somebody will go in and comment and say, oh, what about this? Could we improve this formula we're using here by adding in this factor? Or, what I do is, you've stated it this way. I think you've missed this element. I can add in this bullet point that's an important other factor. So we iteratively improve, and that's an important part of innovation, is building on the work of others.
Yeah.
But again, sorry.
No, I was just thinking, but if you think about collaboration tools, sorry for interrupting you, Clark, I'm not sure if you have worked with Miro or Mural, for example, that are supposed to be pretty powerful collaboration tools where you can also have different media in order to collaborate whatever processes or whatever you're working on online. What do you think about those?
You would have to spell out the ones, because I'm not sure which.
It's one. Yeah, one is Miro. It's Miro. It's a collaboration. It's an online collaboration board. And the other one is Mural. It's Mural. They're both pretty powerful, I would say, in terms of collaborating, and particularly also for these idea generation processes. I could find them very useful.
I did see Miro, and it looked interesting, although it seemed, if I recall correctly, it was very visually focused and didn't necessarily have deep data processing behind it. There's another one, it starts with a P, that's sort of a mind mapping one, but you can slap things into it, but you create structures that represent the understanding. And I really strongly believe in the power of conceptual relationships mapped into spatial relationships as a way to express ideas. But it doesn't have any computational ability behind it. And really, I want to link these things. I want to have visuals and computation and links and representations, because all of them are different ways to capture ideas, and they can be related. And I realize I'm asking. Technically, it's complex to implement, and yet again, there was that instance that happened a long time ago, and I'd love to see if that couldn't be resurrected and improved upon. But so I will have to look at Mural. I don't know Mural, so thank you for that pointer. In fact, let me write it down so I remember it next time.
But I think they could be powerful tools for collaboration, but what you're right upon is that they are very visual, and probably they are lacking these aspects that you were exactly mentioning now. And also, I think that if we think about the virtual space, it relates so much also to the practices and how we, for example, I was talking with Shilpa from the Learning Gym about that, how we create an inclusive virtual space, because we are not used to work, or not all of us were used to work remotely. So also the way how we facilitate meetings online, for example, might be a way that is not as inclusive, and therefore it's also more difficult to create that psychologically safe environment, or to facilitate properly ideation processes, just because we are not there yet to say so. I think that might be something. We have Sue saying, thanks a lot. Sue is mentioning a comment. She's mentioning Miro as an online collaboration tool and is asking exactly, does it have deep data processing tools? Mural, Barbara Cobers, I'm not familiar with this one. Do you like it? Both are visual. Yes, I think that's exactly what we were picking up upon, that both are very visual tools, but both of these tools are super powerful in terms of extensions that they are offering. So they are offering a wide range of extensions to other programs. So I assume, without being 100% sure about it, but that's where we should ask Joshua Davis or Isman Tanuri, our Miro experts, the Miro APA group, if they have deep data processing. So thanks a lot, Sue, for the question. I will follow up on that in the chat here. Thank you very much. But clearly, well, we do know that also, just coming back to what I was saying, the aspect of inclusion, how we create that environment for innovation or idea creation is, of course, also something very important. Just as a last question, Clark, because we're already coming at the end of the Virtual Space Hero LinkedIn Live, what is your important, or one of the important aspects that you would suggest when we talk about creating a psychologically safe and inclusive environment in the virtual space for example, a leader or L&D? What do they need to look at?
What a lot of people are talking about now, and I fully agree with this, is creating trust. And I like your notion of inclusivity, to put a little extra effort up front to let people know that they're part of it. Oh, one other thing, Dan Pink differed from DC and Ryan and his thing, and he talked about purpose. And I think this is something that's missed so much, is helping people know why what they do contributes to the organization, and why what the organization does contribute to the society as a whole. They need to feel like what they do matters. And when they do, they're far more, this is an inclusiveness that is beyond just, you know, virtual. It's inclusive. It's that relatedness that DC and Ryan talk about. And I think what you mentioned about how important it is to build that in virtual, putting a little extra effort to get everybody to communicate, and to also, for leaders in particular and L&D, to share a little bit more about their personal lives, be a little bit more open, so that they can see that you're being willing to be trustworthy, and you're opening up the opportunity for them to trust you as well, and to share, and you generate that mutual trust. I think that's a critical element that helps build that sense of inclusivity. We're all human. Share your mistakes. That and being willing to do that, and that you learn from them and don't make them again.
I think that's a fantastic last statement, because we are connecting now here the dots of so many LinkedIn lives that we had that were about trust, about building trust in remote teams. What do we have to do as leaders, but what do we have to do also as team members of a virtual team? What can we do from an organizational perspective in order to have that such a trusted environment in a remote organization? That is really fantastic. Thanks so much for connecting here also the dots again to previous LinkedIn lives. Clark, a big thank you and applause for you. Thanks a lot for being with us here, and thanks a lot for sharing all your knowledge. Those of you out there who are still watching, go to Clark's webpage, quinnovation.com, check it out, and also go to his tremendous blog. Great content. Connect with Clark. He's also tagged in this LinkedIn live, so you can easily connect with him here on LinkedIn if you wish so. Clark, deep thank you very much again for joining me here. And you know that I prepared sort of a virtual coffee for you backstage. I'm there with you in a minute.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thank everybody who was here. And I wish you all the best. Talk to you in a minute.
Thank you. See you in a minute. Thanks a lot. Dear Virtual Space Hero community, you were slightly more silent tonight than the other days, but we do know that you are out there. You can also, if you're watching the replay, because you know that this conversation is available as a replay on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Facebook. So if you have questions that come up, that pop up afterwards, don't worry, just post them there as well. And we are going to pick them up or comment on them, of course. So thank you very much for joining us. And to give you an outlook, next week we are staying within the organizational context, but moving towards more the managerial aspects, because we are going to talk about with Renz Green about how we can use stories at work. And we're particularly talking about how we as leaders can use stories at work. And with that, I'm wishing you a beautiful evening. Enjoy your evening, or if it is morning or afternoon, wherever you are based currently. And thanks a lot for following. Thanks for participating. And I hope to see you next week. So see you then. Bye.